Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a huge topic, the UN's Blue Helmets. That force that was created to keep the peace, but, well, they've had to reinvent themselves over and over again as the world's conflicts just keep changing.
Yeah, you've definitely seen them on the news, right? The soldiers with those iconic blue helmets, usually in some really intense conflict zone. But what do they actually do? Well, as we're about to find out, their mission is way more complicated and has changed more dramatically than you might think.
So, to really get what peacekeeping is all about today, we gotta go back, way back to the beginning. And here's the crazy thing this whole idea, it wasn't even the UN's original plan. Nope, it was actually a clever workaround, a brand new tool they had to invent for a world that was basically paralyzed by the Cold War.
See, the UN Charter, its original plan was for something much more aggressive, something called peace enforcement. But, with the US and the Soviet Union having veto power in the Security Council, that plan was pretty much dead on arrival. There was just no way. So the world was in this bind. It desperately needed a way to handle conflicts without the two big superpowers going head to head. And right out of that necessity, traditional peacekeeping was born.
Okay, so this new approach, it was built on three really important principles. You could call them the golden rules. Rule number one, consent. Both sides, or all sides, had to actually agree to let the peacekeepers in. Rule two, impartiality. The peacekeepers couldn't take sides, no matter what. And rule three, they could only use force in self-defense. That's it. The whole point wasn't to win a war, right? It was just to hold on to a really fragile peace.
And this really shows you the night and day difference. Think about it like this. Traditional peacekeeping, that's chapter 6 stuff, is like being a neutral referee. The game is paused, and everyone has agreed you can be on the field. But peace enforcement, that's chapter 7, whoa, that is a totally different ballgame. That's the UN basically saying, we're sending in a military force, we don't need your consent, and we might even take a side to stop the fighting. Seriously, getting this difference is absolutely key to understanding the whole story.
All right, so then the Berlin Wall comes down, and this didn't just end the Cold War. For peacekeeping, it changed everything. Suddenly, the UN is in this whole new era, and it's facing a new and frankly much more brutal kind of war. And I mean, the change was immediate. For the first, 40 years of the UN's existence, peacekeeping missions were pretty rare. But after 1988, when the Security Council wasn't constantly deadlocked anymore, man, the floodgates just opened. Get this, in a single decade, they launched 36 new missions. That is an absolutely insane, unprecedented surge. And of course, all those new missions cost money. A lot of money. The cost was just staggering. The peacekeeping budget went from under $500 million in 1990 to about $5.5 billion by 2007. I mean, that's more than a 10-fold increase. It just goes to show how much the world suddenly started relying on these blue helmets. But here's the thing, it wasn't just about more missions and a bigger budget. The very nature of the wars they were dealing with had changed. Remember how the original peacekeepers were like referees for wars between countries? Well, this new era was all about brutal civil wars, conflicts happening inside a single country. And that meant they needed a completely new playbook. They called it second-generation peacekeeping. So what was in this new playbook? Well, all of a sudden, peacekeepers were being asked to do some serious nation building. I mean, we're talking about everything from delivering humanitarian aid, to organizing and watching over elections, to disarming former fighters, and even training up the local police. Their job description went way, way beyond just standing on a line and watching a ceasefire. But this huge, ambitious leap into the chaos of civil wars, well, it didn't go smoothly. In fact, it led to a series of just catastrophic failures. Those three golden rules that had worked for decades, suddenly they just weren't enough. And these failures shook the UN and the world's confidence in it right to its very core. Somalia, Bosnia, Rwanda. In the mid-90s, those names became shorthand for failure. Think about it. Peacekeepers were sent into these absolutely horrific situations, but their mandates were unclear, their hands were tied. They were told to stay impartial, even when they were staring genocide in the face. They couldn't stop these mass atrocities, and that just created this devastating crisis of confidence. And just to give you a sense of the scale here, at the peak in 1993, the UN had almost 80,000 peacekeepers out in the field. That was really the high point of all that post-Cold War optimism. But then came the tragedies in places like Rwanda and Srebrenica, and that number just plummeted. By the year 2000, you had fewer than 15,000 peacekeepers on duty. Countries just got really hesitant to send their troops into missions that were so dangerous and so complicated. The cost, both in human lives and political fallout, just seemed way too high. But, out of the ashes of those terrible failures, the UN had to learn. It had to adapt. And this led to a new generation of peacekeeping, one that was more cautious for sure, but in some ways, even more ambitious than before.
I mean, this next generation of missions, they were asked to do things that were just unprecedented. In Kosovo, the UN literally had to run the entire civilian administration of the country. And in East Timor, they were basically co-pilots in building a brand new country from scratch. This was completely uncharted territory. The Blue Helmets had never ever tried anything like it. And this quote really gets right to the heart of the problem today. It's this constant dilemma. The world keeps asking the UN to do more and more, to take on these incredibly complex jobs. But are the member countries actually willing to cough up the money and resources needed to pull it off? It's this fundamental tug of war between what we want to achieve globally and what nations are willing to spend.
So that's kind of where we are with peacekeeping today. The mission has gone from just watching a truce line to the massive, monumental task of building entire nations. The challenges are more complex, more dangerous than ever before, and it all boils down to one huge question. In a world with more and more crises popping up, are the nations of the world, really willing to pay the price for peace, both in treasure and in political will? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.